Well, good evening. It is so nice to have you all here tonight on this pretty spring evening. Thank you for joining this Voters Not Politicians presentation. We are very proud to introduce our speaker tonight. Kevin Deegan-Krause will be speaking about Michigan's Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission and why it is important for you to tell the commission about your community. Kevin has been working with VNP for 4 years, and he has a day job. His day job is teaching about elections and election systems to students at Wayne State University. After the presentation, our panelists will answer questions that many of you have already sent us, as well as those that you put in the Q&A, and you'll find the Q&A at the ribbon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't use the chat, please use the Q&A. Our panelists tonight are Charles Beal, who serves as Digital and Targeting Director of Voters Not Politicians. Sandy Serini-Elser, who chairs the Community Mapping Projects, Education and Training activities. Ellen Hanlon, who is our tech assistant tonight, a longtime VNP volunteer, a former project manager, and she taught global business at Oakland University. Sandy is a retired attorney who has practiced law over 30 years. I am Connie Cook. I am a retired University of Michigan professor and administrator, and I chair VNP's Community Mapping Project. If you have questions tonight during the presentation, again, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. The Q&A function works better because it makes it easier for us to answer your questions. We will be recording this session this evening, as well as live streaming it on Facebook. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce Kevin Deegan-Krause.
Thank you, Connie. I so appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure working with all of you. Let me do some initial Zoom checking on this. I need to know from any of you, if you could give me a thumbs up, if you can hear my voice, neither too loud nor too soft, let me know about that. And second, if you can see the screen that says Voters Not Politicians with a bright blue label there. Excellent. Well, it is a pleasure, a great pleasure to be with all of you. I recognize a lot of the names of people who are here tonight. I wish we could be together in person, and I know that someday we will be able again to be together in person. That day may be coming sooner than we think. Although I have to say, one of the nice things, one of the silver linings of the recent experience we've had the last year is the realization that we can also get together this way and sometimes broaden it out to a bigger audience than we might otherwise reach. So I'm so glad to have you out there. I look forward to the day that I can see you. For now, I want to talk about something that is important. This may be the most important thing going on in Michigan right now because it is about how we figure out who's going to run Michigan. So it's the thing that's at the basis, at the bottom of everything else. And as we all know, voters are the ones who should be running Michigan. And so that's what our organization is all about. We are citizens strengthening democracy, as a placard from one of our rallies once put it. Voters Not Politicians is a grassroots movement. It is a nonprofit organization, heavily dependent on volunteers. And we depend on those volunteers to help us get our message out. Our message is one of inclusion. Our message is one of citizens' control of politics. And it's for that reason that we're not affiliated with any specific party or any partisan agenda. Our only agenda is to make democracy work better. One of the ways we're going to do that is by drawing better lines for the people who represent us. We, as Voters Not Politicians, we started this ball rolling way back in 2016 with that one fateful Facebook post that spiraled into 6,000 people working together to pass an amendment to the Constitution of the state of Michigan that will end gerrymandering and create an entirely new set of lines and new rules for how we create those lines so that voters choose their politicians and not the other way around. But the task isn't over. Getting that amendment passed was an amazing thing. And I'm sure that many of you shared the joy on that night when it passed. But that was the beginning, not the end of a process, because we still have to make sure that those lines are drawn right. We've laid all the groundwork, but we need to make sure that the commission that's deciding on it gets the information they need to do a good job. And that's why we're here tonight. That's what the mission of tonight's brief webinar is. So really, I want to do four things. I want to talk about redistricting, and I realize many of you may know this up and down, inside and out, but some of you may not. So I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then I want to talk about what the commission, the new commission, will do. A lot of us worked hard for that commission. What is it actually going to do, and how's it going to do it? And then dive into the heart of the matter. I want to talk about community. I want to talk about how we define our communities, how we define the needs of our communities. And then the last thing, I want to make sure that everybody knows and is energized and is ready to get their voice out there about their own community. So those are the four things I want to do. But I want to start with redistricting. And with that first question that some of you may still have, what is a district anyway? So the reason we're here together, the reason Voters Not Politicians exists, is because the way we vote in the United States, in the state of Michigan, is to use defined geographic areas to tell us how we're going to elect our leaders. So a district is a distinct set of boundaries, and within those boundaries, for any given office, whether that's the state house or the state senate or the US House, we vote for candidates and we elect one candidate to represent that particular district. And then all of those candidates together, they compose the legislature. So districts, you can imagine, are really important for every single member of the state house or the state senate or the US House. There is a specific district. And drawing those lines proves to be an incredibly complicated process because people move around. So in 1964, the Supreme Court decided that every district should have roughly the same size population as every other district. That seems pretty obvious, and it had been a practice, but it hadn't been a reinforced practice. So it had drifted by a huge amount from the founders' initial decisions on this. But in 1964, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the notion that every district should have roughly the same population so that every person could have roughly equivalently powerful votes. But we draw those lines to make equal districts, and then people move around. So sometimes they leave districts, and sometimes they enter districts, sometimes they're born, sometimes they pass away. And what that means over time is that in any given geographical space, the population is fluctuating. And that's why every now and again, and specifically in the Constitution, it says every 10 years, we use our census data to redraw those lines so that the districts are back in equilibrium, so that again, every person's vote counts roughly the same. That's why we redistrict, but it turns out that for a long time, politicians used that process not to redress inequality, but actually to create it, to design districts that look like this, and look like this, and like this. The kinds of districts that you saw show during that campaign in 2018, the kind of district that's designed to allow politicians to choose their voters and not the other way around. And increasingly, really from the 1970s and 80s on, with more demographic data and really sophisticated computers, they not only did that gerrymandering, which had been done for a long time, but they did it with surgical precision so that they could make sure that they alone won and that everybody else lost. That's what happened to the process of redistricting. It became a political tool. And that's why we have a redistricting commission to take it out of the hands of politicians and put it back in the hands where it belongs, the hands of ordinary people, in the hands of you and me. And Voters Not Politicians movement of 6,000, or our goal in that grassroots movement was to create a commission of 13 ordinary people, people literally chosen at random from among those who applied and from among those who didn't have connections with politicians. So 13 ordinary people like you and like me who have the common sense to look at a set of district lines and say, these are fair, these aren't fair, and chosen so that there are equal representatives from both of the major parties and a significant, even larger number of those who don't associate with any of the major parties. That's the commission, and this is going to be their job. They have a big job ahead of them. That commission has to draw 110 districts for the state house, 38 districts for the state senate, 14 districts for the US Congress. That's a lot of lines to draw. And they've got to have good information to draw the lines. Now, census data they'll have, admittedly a little bit delayed because of COVID. Other data they'll have. What they need is the information they don't have about what communities actually look like, so where they should draw those lines. And so what they're going to be doing over time is gathering information, and that time is starting right now. So they're going to be receiving public comments by mail, by in-person conversations through email, and according to the constitutional amendment that we all passed, they are hosting town halls. Now, they're going to be hosting more than they have to according to the amendment, but they're going to be hosting town halls so that they can hear from all of us. The schedule looks a little bit like this. During 2021, they're going to be holding those hearings. Then they're going to go and draft the maps after they've done at least 16 public hearings. And then they'll come back to communities and they'll host at least 9 more public hearings to make sure that the maps that they've drawn actually make sense, that they actually correspond to what the communities look like, and then they'll get a chance to go back and to reconsider those maps. The whole idea is to get those maps approved by January of 2022. That's a little bit later than we expected because of a global pandemic. And then those maps will be able to be used in the 2022 elections in August, and then again in November. And those will be the first maps in Michigan history that aren't in one way or another gerrymandered. It's really going to be a momentous day. And you can see there's a really ambitious schedule of public hearings. Here's the tentative schedule, and you can see that this commission is going everywhere in the state. If you actually did a population density map of the state, it would look exactly like the map of where they are going. So Jackson and Marquette and Midland, all the way down to Detroit and Warren and Grand Rapids, this is going to be their schedule. And they're going to be holding a series of in-person meetings with online presence as well. So if you can make one of these meetings, we really encourage it. If you can't make one of them, you'll still be able to attend online because of the technology that's available to us now. So what are they going to be doing when they're drawing these maps? Well, we've actually told them what to do. Not to say where the line should be drawn, but what principles they should use in drawing those lines. And so the constitutional amendment that we created contains 7 criteria in ranked order. So from the most important, you have to make sure you do the first one first, and then you have to do the second one and the third one. And you can see some of these are pretty obvious, but they still needed to be codified in law. So these have to follow all federal laws. They've got to be contiguous. They've all got to touch one another in one form or another. They've also got to, they should, to the extent they're near the bottom, as much as possible, they should follow existing boundaries of cities and counties, and they should be compact. So none of those strange shapes that we saw. But those strange shapes are strange because people were doing them on purpose to remove the will of the voter and impose the will of the politicians. And that's where the 3 in the middle come in. So these are sort of basically following laws and common sense. These are the kinds of things we would like to see if it's at all possible. The really key ones, the ones that the commission needs our help with, are the ones in the middle. Now, the 4 and 5, actually, they can use existing data to do, and those are ones that allow for no party advantage and no candidate advantage. So we make sure in those cases that no specific party is making these decisions, and the decisions aren't being made in the benefit of a particular party. And then we're going to need to talk about communities of interest. But the first goal here was to take partisanship out. Now, the commission knows how to take partisanship out, and they are divided into multiple different groups across partisan lines, and no map can be created until all of those partisan groups actually agree, at least 2 members from each of those groups. That's a remarkable thing in a divided and polarized country, that 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans and 2 independents have to agree with any map that's going to be passed. something really to be proud of. We did something really magnificent when we did this in Michigan. And if only the other institutions of the state and the country could do the same thing, we might find ourselves in a better place. But the other thing that needs to happen for this process to work is not just to get partisanship out, but to get community in, to make sure that community is actually represented in those decisions. So the negative criteria, getting party and candidates out of the decision-making process, that the commission can do. Where they need us is telling us what the district boundaries should look like so they don't accidentally violate, break, draw lines through any of the communities that we hold near and dear. And that makes it necessary for us to go one step deeper and actually to think for once about what it is that defines our community and what are the needs of those communities. So in the constitutional amendment, we define these communities of interest not as political or candidate-based places or spaces, but defined by the things that bind us together as human beings, by where we work and where we shop, by what kind of transportation we use, what our natural landscape looks like, and what are the threats and the beauties of the environment around us. So these shared economic interests, and also the shared cultural and historical interests. What things do we revere? Where do we go together to learn? Where do we go together to worship? Where do we go together to enjoy? Where do we go together to express ourselves? These kinds of cultural and historical interests are what keeps us together. They bind us. And we need to make sure that the commission knows what our community looks like, so that when they draw those lines, they draw them with those communities kept intact. They draw them with those communities kept whole. And those communities are varied and multiple. And all of us are members of multiple different kinds of communities. For our example here, we picked Joe. You know, if you think about Joe, Joe has a whole variety of different communities that he holds near and dear. So if he were drawing those communities, he might draw them like this, because he's a member of the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi. Or he might draw them like this because he teaches in the Detroit Public Schools. Or he might draw them like this because he lives and rents in Oak Park. Or he might draw them like this because he's an avid bicycle rider and he knows where all the great bike paths are. So Joe may have multiple different communities. That's okay. And in fact, that's what the commission needs to know as they draw those lines, because they're going to draw those lines to cut as few of those important communities in half in multiple pieces as possible. And so you can imagine a variety of things that communities think about that they need to be kept together in order to make sure their voice is heard. So, you know, things like air and water quality or school funding or transit, where we can go, how we can get there. All of these things are dependent on what our politicians do, those people who represent us in Lansing and in Washington. And if we take the voice of a particular community and we fragment it into multiple pieces, it's going to be really hard for any politician to pay attention to those questions. And therefore, it's going to be really hard for those political questions to find the representation that they deserve. But when communities are kept together, they can express themselves and they can make sure that those voices are heard. And we went out and we talked to people and we asked them a whole variety of questions about what do you wish that your representatives heard that they're not hearing now? And so Kermit Williams, when we asked him, said that we wanted the state to hear us when they're making roads, when they're making bike lanes and other kinds of decisions about local transit. They want to make sure that the local community has a say in how those transit lines are drawn. And that means keeping the community intact and not split down the middle, as we see specifically with regard to parts of Pontiac. Or we need to make sure, as Rebecca Islam said, that our voting material contains the languages that are necessary for some of the voters in particular communities to be able to vote effectively. And so we need Lansing to hear that those materials need to be produced in those languages, and that's not going to happen if the people who speak those languages and those who support them are split into multiple different districts. We need to make sure that our communities are kept whole when we are seeking representation for those communities. And if we do this right, it makes everything work better. It makes our communities work better. We get better representation. We get elected officials who actually know and care what their communities are like, because those communities aren't fragmented across boundaries. And we ultimately get government that works better because it takes into account the interests of the communities that send their representatives to Lansing. That's why we as communities need to identify ourselves to the commission. So how do we do that? How do we actually identify ourselves as communities, and how do we make sure that the commission knows about those communities? Well, the way we do that is to send them maps, to bring them maps. They're going to be holding hearings. We can go up, we can show up with maps and say, this is my community, or we can send them maps. Either way, what we need to do is we need to send them a visual or graphic representation of where our community is, the physical space of it, with some explanation of why that's what our community consists of. So as you can imagine, there are lots of different ways that you could do this. In a technological age, we can figure out lots of different ways to make sure that our voice is heard in that way, lots of different ways to create maps. And there are two in specific that Voters Not Politicians and the Commission has been working with. And they're called representable.org and Districter with no last E. That seems to be a thing these days. Representable.org and Districter.org. These are two websites. I've used them both. I played around with them. They're websites where you can go and use mapping software, pretty simple to use. With a click of a mouse and with a keyboard, you can actually go in and you can draw your community and you can write about your community. Representable has you write about it first and then draw it. Districter has you draw it first and then write about it on the side. But either way, no matter how you do it, what you'll end up with is a document with a map and an explanation. So actually, when I did it for my own community, I live in Ferndale, but my community is much bigger than just the boundaries of my city. When I did it, I created the map. I drew it on the software. I put in an explanation. I hit send, and they actually sent me a PDF document with all of the information and all of my comments that I can immediately send right on to the commission, or that I can print out and take by hand to the commission when they meet in my community. You can also use simple software like Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps, other software that allows you to create those maps, and then you can annotate your comments on those particular maps, and you can send those to them as well, either electronically or physically. And if the electronic stuff just doesn't work for you, if you'd rather do something that has the touch and feel of paper and pen, you can do that too. You can draw your maps. You can use an existing map. You can actually draw the map just on a sheet of paper with explanations. As Connie told me yesterday, the best option is you can just get a AAA triptych and you can draw on it with a Sharpie, and you can take that to them and they can see exactly what you have in mind. These are all valid ways to do it, and these are all ways that will be acceptable. And what they will end up doing is taking those in and looking for patterns in what people have drawn. And they'll be looking for places where people have drawn overlapping maps so that they know we better not cut that one in half. We better make sure that our particular map does not contain that kind of division. That's our goal, and this is our method for actually doing it. So it doesn't matter whether you use Representable or Districter, or whether you use Google Maps, or whether you use good old-fashioned paper and pencil. This is the kind of information that our commission is looking for, and this is the kind of information that you can provide them to help them understand where your community actually resides. So what can you do about this? Well, I told you can make those maps and you can send them in, but we're actually encouraging you to go one step further. We're encouraging you to meet with, either in person or online. If it's in person, make sure that it's responsible and socially distanced, but to meet with other members of your community. So you have in your head a map of where your community is. It's in that space. Well, meet with some people in that space and ask them where they define it. And they might define it slightly differently, or they might define it exactly the same, but meet with other members of your community. Think about the issues that are important to you and what kinds of boundaries need to be kept intact so that those issues get paid attention to by our representatives in Lansing, who are there to represent us. And then as you've done that, use your mapping software or use your Sharpie to make sure that those maps get onto paper or get to electronic form so that you can send them in to the commission. And then if you can, physically attend or virtually attend one of those actual public meetings that the commission is going to be holding, so that you can actually hear what they have to say and what they're doing, and you can stand there with your map and say, this is my community, and this is why my community is important, and why when you draw those maps, you should make sure that no lines cut through the places where we all live. That's the whole message that we want to get out to you. Community is important. We need to make sure that this revolutionary redistricting committee knows where those community boundaries are. And so we want you to make your voice known, and we want you to know that the committee is waiting for your voice in this. That's their explicit purpose. That's what we worked so hard to get this into the Michigan Constitution for. And now it's our turn to tell them what communities need to be kept intact, and what those communities should look like. So that's all I want to say for now. I know you've got a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts, and so it's a real privilege and honor to turn it over to people who've been working on this project for a very long time and who know it inside and out. And so if I can turn it over to Charlie and Sandy and Connie, and we've got some questions that we've already had sent to us, and we'll have some other questions that appeared in the Q&A. So if I could ask you all to turn your videos back on, and I'm going to turn my screen sharing off, and we will make sure that we can go from here. So let me just make sure that this happens. I'm going to turn off the sharing, and it should be off. Can I get a thumbs up if the screen sharing is off? Great. So we are good on that. So let me actually go to the questions. We got a bunch of them, but let me start actually with a question for Charlie Beal. Charlie, Irma, who lives in West Bloomfield, actually asked, she asked about the voter suppression bills that are currently in the legislature. And she asked, how would those proposed voter suppression bills impact the work of the commission? How would they affect the drawing of the district maps?
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and great question, Irma. So the good news is these 39 bills that were submitted into the state Senate last week will not impact redistricting directly. There's no bills that try to, the great thing about Proposal 2 is that it is all in our Constitution as an amendment. So it is extremely difficult to undermine. One of the only attempts that can be made is to try to reduce funding for the commission, which is very difficult because it's sort of married to the Secretary of State's annual budget as well.
All right, great. The next question actually came from Mary Jo in Dearborn. And she knows that a whole variety of communities are doing this community of interest work. And so there are volunteers out who are trying to work on this. I know some of my colleagues from Wayne are doing work as well. Is there any way of knowing whether there are other volunteers who are also doing that community of interest work? Connie, I think you've taken an interest in this, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Kevin, I wish there were an easy way to know who else is doing the same work in your own community. And right now, I don't know of an easy way, but I can tell you that there are several organizations working on redistricting and trying to make sure that communities are informed about it and want to participate in the redistricting process. One of the groups is the League of Women Voters. Another is the Michigan Nonprofit Association. A third is Promote the Vote. And also, obviously, Voters Not Politicians, working all across the state with hundreds of volunteers. So check with those organizations to find out if they're active in your community. And I believe that after the maps are submitted, it will be possible for everybody to see the maps that are submitted for their own community.
That's great. Connie, would you mind just dropping into the chat? I know we're sort of providing information in the chat. Just the names of some of those organizations so that people can go over there and check those out. Please don't leave your questions in the chat, but you can look in the chat to get some of the other information. And I know Ellen's been putting some information in the chat as well. So thank you, Connie.
I will do that.
We will figure out how to bring people together on this. The next question actually for Sandy, and this is actually both for Lisa from Ann Arbor, who asked it earlier today, and then Amy on the chat today. Both asked similar questions about the current status of the redistricting deadlines, if those have been changed, and how the delays and the issues with the census data will affect the work of the commission.
Right. Thank you, Kevin and Lisa. And I know a couple other people asked this question as well. You probably heard that the census data is not going to be coming out until November 30th, which is not consistent with the deadline that Kevin mentioned in his presentation. The Constitution said the maps had to be completed by November 1st. So what the commission has done through their attorney has asked the Supreme Court to extend the date for providing final maps to sometime in mid-January. The Supreme Court has not yet ruled on that, but we do hope that they will agree to that request. We're not sure exactly what date it'll be extended to, but it will be past the November 30th date when we expect the census numbers.
I think we are getting the census numbers this year on September 30th. Ordinarily, they'd be coming in February or March.
Yeah.
So it's really late this year. It's a shame.
Yes,
that's right. So couple quick other questions that are a little bit more technical in nature. And Charlie, I was wondering if you could talk about those. So, a couple people talked specifically about asked whether the district lines can divide cities or counties and exactly how that works out. Those are 6 and 7 on the list. And if you have a sense of really, how the district and county lines will be factored in when drawing these particular lines.
Sure. So in the criteria, respecting existing county and municipal boundaries is part of the criteria, but it falls underneath communities of interest, which is the third criteria. Yes, they will be respected to some degree, but if a community of interest goes across a county line, which is actually very typical, especially in the Detroit metropolitan area, they will be considered first in that respect. And this is kind of getting into redistricting is weighting and counterweighting all of these different criteria to make these maps representative of the people. So.
Absolutely. And some people have pointed out that Michigan's municipalities themselves, especially in the Detroit area, they look like they've been gerrymandered already. And so actually, if we don't want those funny shapes, sometimes what we want to do is to make sure that the community is paid attention to first. And a lot of work went into the drafting of that particular legislation. There was one other question, Charlie, that came up, which is whether there would be any say by the public in the drawing of county lines or local lines, and if VNP is working on that at all.
Sure. So we don't have an official program or project in that space, but we do have some local volunteers in some part of the states that are getting involved with the county commission redistricting process. So the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission is responsible for the 3 statewide maps: the state house, state senate, and congressional maps. And then the counties set up essentially a redistricting commission of their own that will cover the redrawing of county commissioner maps. And so we anticipate, I believe the statutory language is that they have 30 days after the publishing of the final census data to approve and redraw their county commissioner seats. So kind of looking at this now, we would be looking at September and October for when counties are going to be doing that. I would just say, the state level maps are incredibly important, but all politics is local, and local governments make big decisions that impact our lives every day. So I would highly suggest looking into that process in your own county and seeing which ways you can get involved.
Yeah, pay attention, because especially at that level, you know your county commissioner, they know you, and it's a lot harder for them to sort of slip something by as long as people are paying attention. So do pay attention to those county lines. We had one question from Carol in Detroit. Connie, I think if you don't mind dealing with this one, Carol wrote that between coronavirus and the 2020 election, there's been a ton of misinformation, active disinformation in media. So Carol was wondering what's being done to make sure that the commission isn't inundated with this kind of disinformation, that those meetings don't get overwhelmed by the kinds of people who spread that kind of stuff already.
Why, Carol's very smart. We've watched that situation for the last few years, and it's horrible to watch it. And we hope it doesn't hurt the redistricting process in Michigan. The commission is still hiring staff and figuring out how they're going to handle public hearings. So they haven't gotten into details like what to do about inaccurate social media posts, but I think they will. And we are going to be doing a webinar with the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan on April 20th that will engage some commissioners from Arizona and California and other redistricting experts. And their job that night is to handle some of these tough questions, how they've dealt with these problems in other states. We'd like to learn from other people and use their guidance so that Michigan can make sure that its redistricting goes smoothly.
Thank you. That's very important.
Kevin, can you talk closer to the microphone, please?
Absolutely. I don't know what's going on here. Can you hear me a little better now?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. Well, let me switch to the other microphone. That's why we always have two. So let me ask now, can you hear me a little better?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, the power of redundancy. Excellent. So let me
the power of a smart professor.
Well, yes, that's the power of someone who's had this go wrong too many times to leave it to chance. So Arlene, actually in Grand Haven, was wondering, and I think Sandy, if you don't mind talking about this, she was wondering about when we say community, how big or how small are we talking about? What's the number of people to make a community, and how should we think about that when we talk to the commission?
Right. Well, of course, the districts have certain numbers, but communities can be any size. So you don't need to think about the size of your district very, very much. You just need to think about where your community is. Do the people that you want in your community have shared interests, and what are the geographic boundaries? So you really don't need to think about the number of people in your community so much as you need to think about what holds you together and where you're located. So that would be what Kevin talked about with the shared interests in the economic, cultural, historical. And Kevin, I think you did have a slide that showed the number of people that were in the 2010 districts.
Mm-hmm.
And that will change with the census, but I think it's about 90,000 for the state house, 260 for the state senate, and 760 for the U.S. Congress.
You're right. I love the fact that you know those by heart. That's lovely. That's
close. Yeah.
Dedication and a little geekiness triumph here. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So there were a couple more that have come in just in the last few minutes, and if you don't mind, I want to throw those out to you as well. Marie actually said that she hasn't seen any notices or any other kind of information about this, and so she was wondering, if there is any plan for VNP or anyone else to make sure that people hear about this, so that more than just the diehards can actually get involved with this.
I think Marie is interested in perhaps watching the commission hearings. which everybody can do. And it's true that the newspapers don't seem to be publicizing the dates and times. At least I haven't seen that, although they have begun, media has begun paying attention to redistricting, and we're seeing more and more articles about it. But if you'd like to be on the mailing list for the Redistricting Commission, you just type in Redistricting Michigan, and you will see the website for the Redistricting Commission, and you can become, you can join the email list, and you will get a notice of the hearings, and you can go to their website and see the agendas, read about previous meetings, watch previous meetings, and watch the current meetings. They have to be transparent and public about everything.
That's right. This may be the most transparent Michigan government activity that we've ever seen. They have to follow all the rules that the governor and the state legislature really don't. And so it's going to be a thing to behold. Judith actually pointed out, and thanks to the experts in the audience, that it's not the county commissioners who actually draw the lines, that they are drawn by the county clerk and prosecutor and treasurer and two-party chairs. That doesn't mean you should leave your county commissioner off the hook, because those people answer in some ways, or at least they have to deal with your commissioner. But I appreciate Judith's suggestion also that it's your clerk and your prosecutor and your treasurer and the party chairs who are going to have a critical role in that. So let everybody know, and just pay attention to what they're doing. Pay attention to how those lines are drawn. We don't have an amendment at the county level, so it's up to us. Don was wondering whether the state legislature has continued to take any actions to limit or interfere with the operation of the commission. Charlie, do you want to respond to that one? I know you've been following that a little bit.
Sure. So part of Voters Not Politicians proposal 2 implementation plan includes defense of the amendment as well, and we have paid very close attention to it, as well as defending it in court. So there has been an ongoing lawsuit against the commission against the amendment. However, at every juncture in the courts, it has had no legal standing and has been dismissed. And so in terms of the legislature specifically, they did reduce the budget of the Secretary of State's in 2019, I believe, and it reduced the Secretary of State's budget by 25%, which meant that the Redistricting Commission's budget was also reduced by 25%. So you'll see these kind of indirect attempts, but again, I go back to Proposal 2 was extremely comprehensive. There was a lot of forecasting of ways in which the legislature could tinker with this if they wanted to, and that's why the amendment was written very comprehensively to ensure and protect it.
Great, thank you. Warner, actually, hi Warner. I recognize Warner from some other meetings I've been in. He actually asks another technical question. Sandy, if you don't mind, he was wondering what's the relationship between the 3 different levels of maps. So the state Senate, the state House, and the congressional maps in terms of one another and in terms of the communities of interest that are defining them.
Right. Well, so as you know, the commission is, as Kevin said, the commission is going to draw 3 separate sets of maps. So from a community's perspective, again, you are just going to be drawing your community, and you don't have to think about whether it's going to fit in the state House, state Senate, or the US Congress. Hopefully, you can have your community be layered with other communities so that they're all together in the same state House, state Senate, and state Congress. But that may not be possible because the sizes are so different. So that's one of the jobs the commission is going to have to work on. And I think they'll consider all of the maps that you submit or information that you provide to try to make sure that everybody is covered in as many districts as possible.
Great. So Lisa, Oliver actually asks a slightly different question, and she's wondering, and there are a couple different questions that are wondering about the mechanics of it, and they go beyond, I think, our effort to sort of define what community is, but some thoughts about what struggles the commission itself is going to face. And I know people are interested in that process. We're going to get to watch it live, but Lisa's question is the idea of community of interest and the concept that we talked about when we were trying to introduce gerrymandering of packing. And she's wondering, how does keeping a community of interest together, how does that differ from this idea of packing people, your opponents, into a particular district?
I think that is such a good question.
Yeah.
We wanted to end partisan gerrymandering because we felt that it was wasting votes to have groups packed into a district and the representatives elected by maybe 80% of the population or voters there. And it is true that we are trying to draw boundaries around communities, but we are also suggesting to those communities of interest that when they go to the commission, they tell the commission what they'd like to see happen. And if they are numerous, too big for a specific size district, like a state house district, for example, they might say, we'd like to have our community divided into 2 parts or 3 parts so that we will have 2 voices or 3 voices in the state house from now on, when we've just had 1 in the past.
Great.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that really, it sort of encapsulates the idea, and that really it's the community voice about how the community itself wants to be represented.
Yes.
That is
yes.
core to this kind of thing. Most of the communities we've been talking about have been relatively small communities that could lose their voice by being split apart. There are other larger communities in the state that could actually lose voices by being clumped all together. And so we need communities themselves to think about that in that process.
And we're also suggesting that they tell the commission what other communities are their allies and would like to form a coalition and be in the same district with them, and which other communities are a poor choice for them because the interests are so very different. So the communities have an opportunity to speak to the commission, draw their boundaries, and then tell the commission what they're hoping will happen.
Excellent. There are a couple technical commission related questions. Charlie, maybe if you don't mind talking about these. Kathy was wondering, just in a technical standpoint, of what happens when 2 people from a specific commission group, if they don't agree with the map. So what happens if we get to the end of the process and there isn't that kind of agreement? And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, they do. So you need sorry, my dog is about to start barking, so apologies. But the commission is made up of 13 people. There's 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, 5 unaffiliated. So you need 2 from the Democrat and Republican bucket, and then you need 3 from the unaffiliated bucket. So you could pass maps where only 2 of the 4 Democrats are in support of it if the rest of the commission does vote to approve it. If they vote on a map and they can't reach a consensus, they can go back to the drawing board and offer another version to the commission at large, and they can essentially they may have to repeat their vote and a few times. And as long as they finish under their deadline, that's the end goal.
And if I understand it right, if there is a deadlock at the end, they use ranked choice voting as a mechanism for resolving those finals. So there's no possibility that they end up with no decision. That the way that, as you said, meticulously crafted amendment is structured, there is always an end game in this, and it's one that promotes kind of common interests rather than divisive interests. And I think that's a really important important addition.
That's true.
So there's one question here from Mary, and she says one of the criteria of the amendment says no partisan consideration. But then she noted that in order that the commission would actually have to know the party preference of a precinct in order to make sure that the district lines didn't take party preference into account. So she's wondering about that dance between knowing and not knowing, between partisan lines and not partisan lines. And I'm wondering if any of you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I can start with this question off. So there is a concept called an efficiency gap. So there's a way that you can actually evaluate a set of maps after they're drawn, where you can actually see if the maps are giving an unfair partisan advantage to one party or another. And so that's an evaluation that the line drawing and technical service firm for the commission can do for them. And they can perform that evaluation, and the public could perform an independent evaluation as well, without the commission actually using partisan or precinct data when they're drawing the maps.
Got it. And then Don was actually asked a similar sort of technical kind of question, but talked about the fact that certain districts are quite rural, certain districts are quite urban, and that communities of interest might serve to pack people from one party or another into those districts. How do we balance those things? And I know we're repeating a little bit, but I want to make sure that we were able to respond to the specific questions as they're asked. Anyone want to talk about that one?
I'm trying to read the question.
It's the one at 739 from Don Duquette.
Yes, okay. And we don't want to pack people into districts. We want people to choose whether they're going to be in one district or two districts or three districts. And how do we balance the rural and urban interests? I think that's not what the commission is trying to do. What it's trying to do is make sure that the communities that testify before the commission are well represented and represented the way they would like to be. I don't think the commission is trying to do artificial balancing of rural and urban. Rather, is trying to value the testimony and maps submitted by individual communities of interest.
Absolutely. And I think your previous notion about how communities can ask for themselves to be represented in certain ways actually deals with that quite precisely, that urban areas with larger populations may wish to be dealt with in different ways than rural communities that don't. So this does require a little bit of thought on the part of those of us who want to represent what our community stands for. Mary Jo actually asks, so could the community of interest just be my neighborhood, the boundaries that are dictated by my neighborhood association or something similar to that? Does that help the commission?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a good start. You want to think about if the neighborhood is as large as you want, but if it's just your neighborhood and you have a shared interest that you want to tell the commission about, go ahead and submit that. They'll take all maps that are legitimately submitted.
So Fred actually has a rather technical question. He's asking whether the process will result in changes in precinct boundaries.
I think precincts are totally separate.
Yeah. And isn't it clerks who decide on precinct boundaries?
That's right. I think so. In that sense, I guess it will result in the changes of those precinct boundaries, and then clerks are obligated to draw their precinct boundaries based on the new. Is that right?
Yeah.
This right?
Probably.
I love the fact Fred, you've stumped the panel. Nicely done. But we'll have to get back to you on that, I think.
Yes.
So really, I am looking through the full list here. I think we have this amazing panel has hit every single question on our very long list. Some amazing questions on that list. So we have just 3 minutes left, actually. So if you have any other questions, if you just throw those in, we're just following them straight up. But if no one's got any other questions, oh, actually, there are 2 more. We'll take these as our last 2. So Carol has asked, what will happen to communities that don't extend any voice in representing themselves?
They may be sorry. It may mean that they'd like to stay together, but in fact, they haven't told the commission that, or they'd like to be put into 2 different districts and they haven't told the commission. So they're leaving it up to other people to make the decisions for them. It's just like people who don't vote. When you don't vote, you're giving other people your choice and losing it yourself. The same is true in regard to participation before the commission.
Thank you, Connie. And thank you to Sandy and to Charlie. The last question was actually more of a plea. It was from Ellen. Ellen has put in the chat a feedback form. We would love to know whether this served your needs, whether we can do a better job. We're going to be doing this all across the state for various groups. You know, when we're together face to face, we can tell sometimes how did it go, how did it not go. You can tell by body language. When we're separated by a couple of different screens and a couple of different cameras, it's really hard to know. So if you could spend just a couple of minutes giving us your feedback on how this went, we would love to hear from you. We would also love to hear from you with the broader efforts that Voters Not Politicians is working on. So we are working on communities of interest, but we're also going to be working on a variety of other issues that bring democracy back to the voters of Michigan, that make sure that our politicians listen to us and do as we, the voters, ask them to do. So thank you all so much for your time and energy tonight. Thanks to the amazing panel. Thanks to Ellen for behind the scenes making everything work. And especially just thanks to all of you in the audience for having the time and energy to care about your democracy. We will be in touch because we're going to keep working on this, and we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks all, and until the next time, stay safe. We'll talk to you soon. Make your voice heard.